afternoon. This is W295 AP, Schwartz 106.9 FM and 980 AM, WRNA, Gulf Breeze, Pensacola. World Wide Web at www.wrna980.com. It's time now for You Got the Power with your host, Omar Neal, live.
Well, thanks, Bob, and welcome again to You Got the Power show. I am your host, Omar Neal. Well, for the last few days, we have watched with sorrow the homegoing of none other than the individual, Mr. Floyd, who was assassinated in Minneapolis. I got a chance to see the police chief today, and I have to admit that I was very impressed with this young man and how he articulated his leadership and his response to what happened with Mr. Floyd. However, I recognize that the problems of policing are complex. And particularly policing in a racially divided country. And so today I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to be transparent and honest and forthright. You know, I think about the fact that we have been engaged in this conversation about whether or not police are acting in good faith in accordance with their oath, in accordance with their code of ethics. But many people have never, ever really heard or know about what the police code of ethics is. And so I thought that I'd start out just by reading the code of ethics for police to let you know what we swear to and what we supposed to be doing. The Code of Ethics for Police say, as a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind, to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence or disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all men to liberty, equality, and justice. I will keep my private life unsullied as the example to all, maintain courageous calm in the face of danger, scorn or ridicule, develop self-restraint, and be constantly mindful of the welfare of others, honest in thought and deed in both my personal and official life. I will be exemplary in obeying the laws of the land and the regulations of my department. Whatever I see or hear of a confidential nature or that is confided in me in my official capacity will be kept ever secret unless revelation is necessary in the performance of my duty. I will never act officiously or permit personal feelings, prejudices, animosities, or friendships to influence my decisions. With no compromise for crime, and with relentless prosecution of criminals, I will enforce the law courteously and appropriately, without fear or favor, malice or ill will, never employing unnecessary force or violence, and never accepting gratuities. I recognize the badge of my office as a symbol of public faith, and I accept it as a public trust to be held so long as I am true to the ethics of the police service. I will constantly strive to achieve these objectives and ideals, dedicating myself before God to my chosen profession, law enforcement. Well, that's what police swear to. And we see oftentimes that it is not employed as it has been written. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about what can we do. You know, there are people who are literally calling for the dismantlement of the police service as we know it, and the defunding of police departments. and that is really a highly controversial conversation. And so what I want to do is I want to talk with a friend of mine. I want to bring on none other than David Alexander. David Alexander is the former police chief of Pensacola, Florida. We've had him on several occasions, and I wanted to talk to him because he served at the highest level of a police department as the chief, but he also is an African-American man. And so I wanted to kind of engage him in this conversation. I also want you to know that we're going to give you an opportunity to be a part of the conversation by giving us a call at 1-646-558-8656 is the number to call. That's 1-646-558-8656 is the number to call. Let me give you the number again. It's 1-646-558-8656 is the number to call. The access code to the program is 545-094-732. That's 545-094-732. Chief Alexander, how you doing, my friend?
Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
I'm not hearing you.
You're not hearing me.
Let me make sure that you have your. Okay, now, yeah, I can hear you now. Okay.
You can hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
You know what? Let me say this, man. I know you have been watching this thing as I have. Golly, Chief, what are you seeing out here? And is there a point of reconciliation here? Or have we gone beyond the point of no return?
No, we haven't gone beyond the point of no return. And first of all, Omar, thank you for allowing me to come on and have this discussion with you today. But the culmination of the George Floyd incident and how even other chiefs around the country are responding to similar acts of misconduct, it gives us a conglomeration of catalyst events that have stirred up a nationwide discussion that leads to police reforms. And certainly, this is not the first time we've dealt with the issues of brutality, incidents of brutality, and the perception of the racial profiling, whether it's real or not. It's there. There were laws the civil rights movement back in the 1960s that dealt with it. And then here we are now. I think one of the biggest things that have been missing throughout from the 60s to this day is that we have constantly failed to look at the sustainability piece once we have reached a point of the process of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a lifelong process, and what it requires is people to be committed that there are just certain things we're not going to tolerate, and we're going to work together to make sure it does not happen.
Chief, let me go back to this because I really want to have a conversation with you. You know, you said that we've been dealing with this for years, and I agree with you. But there've never been the reform that's sustainable. It's never been the reform or recognition that race has it's an integral element of the divide between police and communities of color. And until we recognize, that was something that the police chief of Indianapolis said today that I'm really impressed with the brother, man, really. And that was my first time really hearing him. You know, I've seen little clips of him, but I really got a chance to hear him today. He is willing to recognize, understand that we got to deal with the racial component of policing if we're ever going to get to, community trust and legitimacy, which is a required element of effective policing.
Yes, and certainly leadership, not just in law enforcement, but leadership in community, especially in politics. These are critical key players, and it has to be more than a discussion during election time. It has to be an ongoing discussion so that the commitment to change and the reforms that need to take place, like I said, can take place and they're sustainable. I like the idea, and you asked me about the environment as a whole. It's a lot of moving parts, which makes it complicating and frustrating for leaders who want the right type of change to take place because there are a lot of variables, there are a lot of moving parts, and you also see people rushing to get something done so they can say we've resolved it and it's over with. But this is a lifelong commitment and a lifelong process of reconciliation. But all opportunities for reconciliation starts off with a catalyst event that forces us to acknowledge what is a matter of fact. And what now I think is being acknowledged nationwide is that race for far too long has played an integral part in whether a person of color is treated fair by law enforcement across the board. And so I think that that conversation has got to move from an acknowledgement to a course of action that requires commitment. And how we communicate is very important. I was on the air with Mr. Hill this morning, and we were talking about how organizations can say we are structured to reach out to the community and talk to people and interact with people. And you think you're communicating, you think you're talking to people, you think you're addressing their needs, but you've never heard them. You never sat down and had a conversation, and neither is there any understanding. So when you're talking to them, they're looking at you as if you really don't care. And then you're saying to them in a sense that, well, you don't care about your own situation. So there's fuel frustration. And when an incident like the George Floyd case comes up, now you got all these unresolved issues of racial practices that have happened before. And all it does is re-inflict those and open those wounds again. And now you're dealing with a continuation of mistrust. And that's why today leadership is paramount, and we have to be very serious about who will take the lead of these organizations and what their goals and objectives will be regarding race relations.
Let me say this, Chief, because you've been, and I continue to reiterate, you've been a chief, you've been the highest level in a municipal law enforcement agency, right? The point of the matter is you're talking to the community about things that need to be changed within the department. The community can't change those things. We know that we have certain people that are in our ranks, and I'm a law enforcement officer as well. Let me be clear on that. So I'm not talking just from a talk show host. I was the mayor of a city and a law enforcement officer. So I'm talking to you from a fellow law enforcement officer. We know that there are people in the police ranks that shouldn't be there. They don't have the requisite temperament. They don't have what it takes to be a law enforcement officer to service all of the people, right? Why is it that we don't clean house within, and I'm not speaking of any particular department, let me be clear. We don't clean house if we can't correct the things within law enforcement, how can people trust us? Why are we going to ask people to trust us when we have been unwilling to address those critical internal issues we have as law enforcement?
Well, one of the things that is that you can have an awesome chief or sheriff over your department, but you have a culture within the ranks and file of that department that permits and promote practices that are unfair to not only people of color, but unfair to the public, period. And a lot of times these acts of trust breaking goes unchecked until something major happens. And sometimes it requires other people to be affected in that department to the effect that to the point where they're now facing the loss of jobs or punishment or even incarceration by being that close to it. And so sometimes the culture of an organization can permit and promote practices of racial inequality and open bias against people of color. And not just people of color, but also people of socioeconomic, low socioeconomic statuses. So you'll find that you get caught on camera mistreating the homeless, mistreating people of other ethnic minority groups, and that brings a disrepute to the department. And now they have to face that fact that there's a culture that allowed this to happen. So most of the time they get rid of the leader and they bring somebody in, they say, we need you to clean up the culture. But then there's oftentimes there's a leader that also will permit and promote this kind of activity to take place. And there are officers that don't like it, but they have no recourse. And if they're singled out as they don't go along with the flow, they might find themselves suffering ridicule and sometimes punished merely for doing their job and doing it right.
You know, it's interesting. Okay, go ahead. I want you to finish that. Finish your statement.
The third thing that plays into that is a lot of times we don't want to talk about the effects of unionization on the cultural climate in a department. And unions are powerful entities, and they are deeply ingrained in the political process in America. So a lot of times you can have the right policies and procedures to establish a proper culture. You can have a chief or a sheriff that's really wanting things done right, but you can have a powerful union that's gonna really make life very complicated for you to carry those things out. So there are moving parts, like I said, but at the end of the day, those officers that go out and put out 110%, and not just officers, but public first responders, period. Those ones that go out and put out 100% have to suffer the backlash that comes from that small percentage of those that will go out there and misrepresent their position to the public.
Well, one of the problems, Chief, is that people say, okay, if you are going to police the public and hold them accountable for their violation of laws, right? Then why don't you police the police? If police do something inappropriate or violates the Constitution of the citizens, then why don't you police them? Why don't you give the police authority to police themselves? And why is it, as you have alluded to, and you're not the only one who said this, that when good police officers try to speak up, they are normally ridiculed, they are ostracized, and oftentimes they are blacklisted to the point that they don't get requisite promotions because they went against the brotherhood, if you will.
Right.
Why is that the case?
Well, like I said, once you establish a cultural climate in a department that allows certain things to be done, and yes, police should be counted upon and trusted to police themselves. And in fact, Omar, that's what your internal affairs or your professional standards component, which is your compliance, your accountability and compliance component of your department, is responsible for, is making sure the rules are followed by the ranks and the file, start at the very top, all the way down to the level of execution. But we find that breakdown a lot of times begin at the first line of supervision, where things are allowed to happen that goes unchecked. And when that becomes something that's promoted and permitted by your ranks and files, that creates a climate of a set of rules that are there, but you don't necessarily have to go by them. And that's why law enforcement executives don't like the idea of outside oversight committees that can come in and now tell you how to police your own organization. So they have to take on the responsibility of being transparent and making sure that a fair and judicious process exists in your department and in the community where you serve the public. So that's why when I say fairness has to exist in a department as well as in the community, because if you're not treated internally fair, then how can you honestly say that you're treating the public in a fair and impartial way?
You know, you make a salient point there. The point of the matter is this: you spoke about, you know, line officers or supervisors having discretion as to whether or not they will follow the rules or not. Is that how it really is, Chief? Can you, as the chief of police, impose rules, right? and you say, this is how we're going to operate in this department. And as a mayor, obviously I've had to appoint chiefs, right? So
Yes,
I mean,
right.
so when I appoint a chief, I'm saying, chief, run the department. I don't even micromanage the chief. So you're telling me they give you the authority and you will let a sergeant do what he wants to do? I mean, is that how it is in policing?
Well, that could be part of it, is that sergeant is connected to the chief. And so he can circumvent his whole chain of command. Okay. The other thing is,
what do you mean by that? Help me. What do you mean by circumvent his chain of command?
Okay. The sergeant has a lieutenant, and the lieutenant has a captain. The sergeant has a lieutenant, which a lieutenant is usually going to be your mid-level manager. And then of course your captain or your assistant chief is going to be an upper level manager. So you got from assistant chief all the way down to a lieutenant, a chain of authority that exists as a part of the line of communication from the top. So when the chief says you will deal with the public in a courteous and professional manner, and I don't want the use of profanity when you're talking to the public. So now, how that message is conveyed from your office down to the level where officers are interacting with citizens every day, your message can lose its effectiveness. It could, by the time it gets down to the officer, it could be watered down to the point where they feel like that's an option. And then even if it comes down direct to the officers, the interpretation between the officers and the office of the chief can be a barrier to that effective communication. So there has to be clear lines of communications, and there has to be clarity on what's expected at the lowest level, because that's where the public, the face of the chief and the department is displayed to the public by those officers. And that's why a lot of times when the public gets angry, they'll get rid of that chief, or they'll seek to re-elect another sheriff, because the face that's being projected to them is not a fair and impartial way. And obviously, if it's in communities where people are oppressed and economically deprived and people of color, they're gonna see that as a reason for this. And whether it's real or not, the top officer of that agency cannot close a blind eye and pretend it doesn't exist. And if they don't make those adjustments to hold people accountable from their office all the way down to the level of where the citizen interaction takes place, then they're going to suffer both reputation-wise.
Right. You know, one of the things is accountability, right? To him, much is given, much is required, right? I mean, so shouldn't everybody who carries a gun and wear a badge be accountable? I mean, shouldn't everybody be accountable? Regardless of whether or not
absolutely
you're a private or the chief, right? You should be accountable, right?
You should be accountable. You should be accountable.
So that's I think, you know, Chief, this is why people are frustrated. They're frustrated because they're saying this is not rocket science. In any other profession has elements of accountability, of holding people accountable. Everybody does. You know, even they're talking about, you know, the records of police officers are kept secret to the point that they can literally violate in one city and then go to another city and get rehired because there's no transference, there's no database of police infractions. That's a problem.
And you know what? That's a problem. Do you know that I found out that there are certain agencies that elect not to give their data, send their data to the FBI. And I mean, to me, there should be some repercussions. They should have to report to their state, and their state should be accurately tracking this criminal data that breaks down a lot of things that obviously can give you some warning signs within your state that there's some things need to be checked. And you still gotta be connected to the community. Because one of the things I found effective when I was police chief is that the climate of accountability is so simple as knowing what's going on in the community to the point where there are checks and balances. I remember seeing, my wife was working in the banking industry. that the corporate office would strategically send a secret shopper to this bank to ask for certain services and to see if the personnel were going to respond appropriately, and they weren't going to have any warning whatsoever that this person was coming. And so what I'm saying is sometimes knowing the answer before you ask the question is about doing homework. Okay, you got to find ways to create tools that will help you keep those who you are holding accountable. And so being connected to the community, there are ways to find out exactly how things were done. And of course, now we got body cams and dash cams and all kinds of sophisticated technologies. But believe me, when you get these technologies, there are folks out there who will find ways to exploit the imperfection of these technologies and get around and circumvent being held accountable. So that's why we can't go to sleep on it. That's why I said earlier, when you make these gains, whether they be through technology or through procedural justice or whatever the case may be, you gotta maintain the sustainability of it. You cannot go to sleep on that. That is a lifelong process. And when we've dropped the ball on sustainability and accountability, it sets in motion the next wave of subtle turning back history and going back to what was happening before. So it's the recreation of history over and over again. And that's where people, like you said, get frustrated because it seems like these issues are not being resolved. And whereas we're coming a long ways, we're still struggling with the human nature part of it, which is why I put more emphasis. I don't shun training, but there's some things that if you don't have that kind of training before you come to the department, I don't think they can train you to have the right attitude.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about that, because we're talking about there's some basic things that we should accompany you as being a human being, and having deference to the human experience to the point that you preserve life. There's a such thing called legal, and then there's another thing called necessary. There are some things within the law that police officers can legally do, right? But it's not. But there is another threshold that should be reached before you engage in what we call lethal force, right? And that should be necessary. Was it necessary to do this to preserve life? Because that should be the only reason why you use lethal force, is to preserve life, not property, life. And I think that that's one of the problems we have, is that we have a lowered threshold of what the value of humanity. And I think that's translated into how certain people are treated in this country versus other people.
Well, and what has happened is you heard of the term weaponizing race, weaponizing homelessness, weaponizing social class, weaponizing any issue that's going to be controversial that allows you to automatically paint a person as a bad person, and then you can react whatever way you want to react with them. And that's some of the things that haven't been allowed to go on in our society, and it's gone unchecked. So it's not just law enforcement that's responsible for how this cultural climate is established, but it's also your faith institutions. It's also your business institutions. Because, at the end of the day, I look at the business institutes. They still want to collect money, and they only know one color, and that's green. But when you start supporting certain ideologies, and these ideologies have a bias philosophy towards certain classes of people, now you're ignoring who you're getting the money from, but you want to collect the money. So that's where people got to be conscious enough to know, okay, look, I'm not going to continue to support your business if you can't support me being fair, treated fair, even as a consumer. So if you don't demand certain things in return for what you're giving, it'll drain you, it'll frustrate you, and then you'll see these massive rebellious acts that will take place nationwide and in a lot of metropolitan areas, and then the public is forced to react to it, and a lot of times the reaction comes with a lot of mixed emotions, because some people understand it, and they're going to stand up against it, but then there are others going to look for sophisticated ways to to not look at it and focus their attention on something else. So that's why when we get on this big, broad platform, there's a lot of crazy things happen that small communities and cities can actually lose their control of their own narrative.
But let me ask you this, Chief, because, you know, we're talking about a complex situation, and I'm appreciative for this conversation. Let me ask you to look at policing like this. Let me ask this question. Have we asked the police to do the impossible? Which means that because of the multiplicity of issues in our society that requires specificity in terms of skill sets, are we asking the police to do things that they are not equipped to do? Mental health, social work, other areas that may be best utilized in terms of our resources in putting people in those spaces that have expertise in those areas. Should we now revisit when we should deploy the police? For what purpose should it be? And where other services may be more appropriate, deploy them in those areas?
Well, I mean, in theory, yeah, I can agree with you. Yeah, you should look at that. But in actuality, and that's one of the things we were talking about this morning with Mr. Hill, you know, you can establish policies and pass legislation that seems to be almost flawless until you get it to the level of execution. And my case in point is this: when a 911 call is made and you got a frantic caller on the phone, there is a basic info finding to determine what services is needed. Now, if you're having a problem determining this, it's a fire and rescue call, but nevertheless, either way, they send the police, because as a first responder, police are equipped with defibrillators, they're equipped with basic field first aid kits. A lot of them are first aid certified. So a lot of times when you ask for the police to show up during a crisis, they have to have prior exposure to a lot of different possibilities of what might be going on. In the case of mental health, I think it's pretty much nationwide now that most officers have gone through or are currently going through some kind of crisis intervention training, which includes techniques of de-escalation, as well as the awareness of mental illness and how those individuals suffering from mental illness will make your response a challenging response. There are other information that plays into this as well, such as trauma-informed care. So, but the question is, when you get all this training and you establish some departmental policies and procedures, are you required to follow them, or can you at will pick and choose when you will deploy them, and will you be held accountable for you when you do it? That's an internal matter. That's a leadership matter. That is a inspections function matter, and a organizational culture is permissive and promoting the partial policing of a community. That's where your issues of excessive force, your issues of discourtesy to the public. A citizen asks a simple question and they feel like they're being ridiculed because they asked a simple question, and no, there's no positive interaction between that particular community and law enforcement. So what are they supposed to do when something bad goes wrong? And now they're saying, trust us, we're gonna work this out together. I've heard the last several weeks, a lot of leaders get up and say, let us all work together. But you gotta look at what is their history? Where have they stood before this callous event came about? Have they been in the corner, champion, reaching out and talking to people and making sure people understand that you're genuinely concerned about their safety and you're gonna work with them to make sure they are safe? If that has not been the case, then those areas, those jurisdictions are gonna struggle. I don't care how much they say the right thing, but they're gonna struggle with getting issues that might erupt and cause chaos in the community. They're gonna struggle with getting those issues resolved.
You know, it's interesting. The best indicator of what a person would do is what a person has done. That's how I feel.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
So we'll talk about that. Let me bring on some people and let's have a conversation. Give us a call. The number to call is 1-646-558-8656 is the number to call. It's 1-646-558-8656 is the number to call. The access code to the program is 545-094-732. That's 545-094-732. Let me see if I can bring some people on to the conversation.
Okay.
I got some people who moved into another space. Okay. All right. You got the power. What's your comment? 8483.
Good afternoon, Omar, and good afternoon to your guests. I just want to ask a plain and simple question. How can shooting a human being 27 times who do not have a gun in his hand be ruled justifiable homicide? I want the chief to explain that to me as a former law enforcement officer. When you fire one shot and this guy is on the floor of his apartment at 4 a.m. in the morning, I want to understand, how can you shoot this man 27 times? He only weighed 165 pounds. There are 4 deputies in his apartment. No body cameras. They want us to believe that they tased him 2,500 volts of electricity when you tase somebody. They beanbagged him, so they had to use lethal force. Please help me understand.
You know, I think Chief, stay there, Ellison, a second. Chief, there is a such thing as excess. Is that not correct? And we're seeing situations that happen where, the news is littered with cases where, you know, somebody shot 60 times, 70 times, that the people were not armed, and they did that, and the police were able to walk with this notion of qualified immunity because they say they feared for their lives. I mean, come on. I mean, can you fear for your life when you got 4 people against one person that's you've shot already 2-3 times? Obviously, if you had shot with a gun,
I'm going to tell you.
Go ahead.
Here's the thing. First of all, in all my years in law enforcement, any level of force that I have used, I had to clearly justify using that force. And I don't ever know where the standard was lowered for me. But what I'm going to tell you is this: what you permit, you promote. And if you don't hold everybody accountable to the same standard, then that's going to be a way that things can be done inappropriately and have the appearance of being right. But then there's some things going to obviously be wrong, and it'll never get challenged. And to try to answer that question, first of all, I would have to be in that agency to know all the details about what happened. But this is the reason why I'm running for the office. There's not enough transparency, and obviously the public in itself in Escambia County, and the caller didn't want to call it out, but the public has a problem with the police ability to police themselves, because obviously there are folks that are getting caught doing things wrong, and they're getting a slap on the hand. And at the end of the day, evidence is walking out of there. These major investigations are being circumvented, and then people are being charged with charge, and other folks left out that were definitely involved in it. So this stuff doesn't come up by me guessing. I've been out there in the neighborhoods. I've been up in the north end of town. I've been across the water and out in Perdido Key. There's a constant resounding voice of being fed up with the sheriff department not being able to police themselves. So
let's not just say the sheriff department. Let's just say law enforcement, because it's not relegated, Chief. It's not relegated to Pensacola. This is universal, and it's a problem.
It's not. You're right. And what I'm saying is sometimes you can voice your opinion, or you can make your displeasure known to people. But if you don't make that known to the right people in the right settings, then this is how justice is miscarried, because when the right folks need to be here answering that, they get a bye.
But
Omar,
the other thing, let me just say this,
They
Ellison.
get
I'm
a
gonna let you
bye.
say
They
this.
should be publicly answering this question.
Right. Well. That's another thing too. Anybody, because you're running for office, anybody who's running in that same position certainly has the opportunity to be on my show. So I don't want to perceive like I'm not.
Omar, I want to give
time.
the answer that I want to give the answer that the current administration gave me in a public setting.
Go ahead.
I'm listening.
That answer was, we suffer from anxiety. And I said, every last one of those officers should have a mental evaluation. That is totally unacceptable.
Hold up, Ellison. He's saying that police suffer from anxiety is the reason why they can kill somebody shoot somebody 27 times, and that's what an official
said. That is exactly the answer I would give.
Well, first of all,
okay,
that's one of the sad things in America we have allowed to happen. Anytime you want to make an excuse for something, if you can come up with a clinical or medical diagnosis for it, that means you don't have to accept responsibility for actions. I don't think that's going to fly in the climate we're in right now. People are tired of the Band-Aids being put on things that have been a ongoing problem. I think it's time for voters now to step up and go to the polls. And if they waver in what they stand on in terms of fair treatment to the public, we need to make sure these folks don't get elected to office. And they're going to put money behind it. They're going to try to buy your vote. But if you don't look at their track record and judge them based on what they've done in the past, and if they've hidden from these issues in the past, they're going to keep hiding from it in the future.
Well, let me
say this, and then I'll be quiet. I met with some young people just yesterday, and here's the scenario that they're thinking. This is the mindset. When law enforcement kill a black person, they get a free pass. When it's black on black crime, if that person is apprehended, they automatically go to prison for a long time. In each scenario, a life is lost. Let's go back to the 70s, early 70s, right here in Escambia County. Doug Raines stopped Wendell Blackwell out on the interstate, shot him in the head. He said he thought he saw a gun. And here it is, 40-something years later, no gun has been found. Never in the history of Escambia County, Florida, have any officer ever been held accountable for taking the life of a black man or woman. Andrea Kitt at the Grand Hotel, downtown Pensacola. Mike Vickers jumped on the hood of the car. She got the car in reverse, saying that she's trying to run over him, shot her point blank in her chest several times. So my question is, where is the justice?
Well, let me ask this. I'm glad you asked that question, and let me say this: the justice system is not just relegated to law enforcement. Certainly, law enforcement has its role to play. That law enforcement, and I think we talked about it earlier, that there must be accountability to law enforcement for the actions that they engage in. But we have a criminal justice system that we oftentimes have an ancestral relationship with law enforcement to the point that they don't hold law enforcement accountable. That's another area that we have to deal with. And so it is not just one thing, it's multiple things. That's why I don't know. And Ellison, thanks for the phone call. But Chief, can this be reformed? I mean, I'm trying to figure out, what can we do? I mean, is this possible to be remedied? I mean, when you look at the layers and the multiplicity of issues that we've enumerated today, is this beyond repair, or should we just start all over again?
It's not beyond repair, but I can tell you this, Omar, until trust is restored or you're going to have a hard time dealing with it. And I just don't believe that passing laws is going to solve your problem. I think all it's going to do is buy enough time until the next incident occurs. And each time these incidents occur, the backlash and the complexity of it becomes more complex. It gets worse. And I think at the end of the day, like we said earlier, the remedies are very simple. And we have allowed a political system to pretty much take over what it means to be treated fair. We let the political system play with words where you can't even use the words of the English language without somebody telling you philosophically what you believe in. So I think it's time for people who are tired of this kind of stuff to go to the polls and make their frustration and their intolerance of it known. And you got to do homework. You can't sit here, because I'm gonna tell you something. Omar, I've been in law enforcement for over 30 years, and I've watched the political climate. I've watched the cutthroat techniques that take place. I've seen black people do it to black people. I've seen white people do it to white people. I've seen black people do it to white people, and white people do it to black people. And at the end of the day, the public suffers because sometimes they may never know all of the details that went behind what they saw happen before their eyes. And that's one of the sad things about it. And even when we're looking at district attorneys and judges, you better start looking at what have they done, what kind of cases have they presided over, and what type of decisions did they make. You can go back and research it. But you know what? That's too much like doing homework. That's too much like reading books, because I'm telling you, a lot of this stuff you're gonna find is a repetition of history, and the remedies are not very complicated. But when you're trying to look for another way to get around doing something that you might have got caught on or got jammed on the last time, then that's where it gets complicated at.
Let me ask this, Chief. Let me ask this, Chief, because let's since you say it, let's try to be simple. All right, let's simple, because we can get caught up in kind of nuanced conversations and esoteric conversations. I want to do that. One is, shouldn't we have a greater scrutiny of who we recruit as law enforcement? Shouldn't that be a greater scrutiny of the people to whom we recruit from the beginning, right? Not only background, but also mental health checks, implicit bias assessments, all of that before you are even selected to go to their academy, right?
Right.
I mean, because oftentimes what we find is that people have had history, right, that would suggest that they are not appropriately or properly suited to be a law enforcement officer. Everybody can't be a law enforcement officer just because you apply, right? I mean, or just because we need officers, because we have shifts we have to fill, right? We need to be more critical about who, or scrutinizing, if you will, about who we place in uniform and give a badge and a gun to, right?
Well, yes, that's a critical piece.
Right, that's a critical piece. The other thing is, and I want you to respond to all of this, and I hope you can keep, you're a smart dude, so you're gonna keep it all in your head, right? All right, the other thing is too, we talked about culture, and that also has to do with continuum of force protocol, right? Right, I mean, by which we can determine that we use our weapons at last option rather than the first option, right? And that we use our soft skills and we de-escalate, and we talk to people in a certain tone that allows them to calm themselves down. We don't rush into a situation and try to rise to the occasion. We shrink to our training. I mean, all of these things should be indicative of the culture, right, of law enforcement, where it isn't. And I think that when you change the culture, then we can change some other things. And then lastly, you mentioned this, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Chief, and that is, we have to secure the trust and legitimacy of the public. And that's only done when they feel that the department, not just an individual, because you can have individual police officers that do the right thing, but when the
Right.
department themselves have a culture of procedural justice and fairness that's administered equitably throughout the entire jurisdiction, right? That's what people are
Right.
looking for, right? So I want you to
Absolutely.
respond to that.
Absolutely. And I'll start at the top with recruitment and what are we attracting into law enforcement. So back about 10 years ago, recruiters were challenged because they saw the windfall of the shortage of officers. There were other professions recruiting even stronger, paying better. So professional pay was a challenge. And even as they worked to build a professional pay, the question is, what are you using to attract law enforcement into your agency? And so they would show them SWAT videos and drug raids, things that really in certain jurisdictions will hardly ever happen. And if you're on a SWAT team, you may get a SWAT call out once a year. So you'll train for an everyday occurrence, which only happens once, maybe once a year at the most. So if you're using that, you're attracting folks that think they're going to be hyped up. They're going to be going on SWAT call-outs every day. And I mean, this is nothing new. When I got hired on as a police officer, there was a perception that we got in shootouts every single day. And what they didn't realize that most officers go their entire career and never have to shoot anybody, you know? So it's not that you get out here and you get to shooting at folks every single day, but there are shootings that can become a common occurrence to the point that, you know, you got to realize that in itself can attract the wrong type of people. Now, you know, there was always a Dirty Harry mindset, the Clint Eastwood mindset that was used to attract people. You know, go ahead and make my day. Well, you got to realize whatever is festering in the culture, and especially in the public media, a lot of times these things have a tendency to have linkages to law enforcement who's going to respond to the public. So you got to make sure you're attracting people who understand that you may go out once every now and then on a bank robbery. So every day is not a bank robbery, but every day you need to be prepared to respond to a bank robbery. But you're going to have constant contact with the public every single day. So you need to understand the mindsets of what makes up your public. And that's where understanding the various cultures, and this is something that should be a part of their academy training, how to get along with people. So you shouldn't have to teach somebody that's already state certified to be a police officer how to get along with people. They had to have some basic skills before they entered the academy. So a lot of these things could be addressed in the academies. But the other thing is, if you are not screening and you don't have accountability in your screening and hiring practices, you can have all the rules and regs in place, but if nobody's required to follow them, you got folks coming into law enforcement that have no business in there. And then when they've gone through the vetting process, they could be allowed to come back and get in there and cause a problem. And the department takes a black eye over it when the person should have never been allowed to come back to the department. You have field training officers who are there to prepare your officers coming out of the academy to transition into a solo capacity as a beat officer or a street officer. And their job is to prepare them to transfer their knowledge into working experience that allows them to do their job and be effective. If those systems fail you, that's where the quality of your officers begin to deteriorate. So you got to watch for the built-in biases that can be developed by personal likes and personal dislikes. If you got somebody over your hiring process, and let's say, for instance, they have a bias against women, so now women catch it coming through the process, and so this bias go from one social or protected class to another. But the bottom line, if this person meets the qualification, they should be given the consideration for the job. If they've gone through all the steps to get there, they should be allowed to get there. But a lot of times with built-in biases or biases that you don't even know exist on a personal level are allowed to continue to be a part of your process. Now you have a bias selection process.
How do we
So
assess
I
that?
like,
I'm trying to see how do you determine? You making a lot of sense to me, but I want to know
okay,
how do you determine it? Is there a way, a mechanism to measure bias? Is there a mechanism to see to what extent bias has infiltrated your processes, right? To
well,
include things like hiring and
okay,
promotion.
in HR, you have to look at the various functions of your organization. HR specialists and certified HR practitioners, their jobs are to constantly look at the whole functionality of a department, a business, to make sure every function of that business is giving and supporting the goals and objectives of that organization. And it's no different in law enforcement. If you got people in place, and a lot of times they've been there a long time, sometimes folks are set in their ways and things have changed and they need to change and make adjustments, but they haven't. So if you don't pay attention to those things as an executive officer and ask those questions, you may be sitting on a problem that's been festering for a while, and it has caused you to lose personnel that other people are hiring. And one of the sad things, when you see someone leave our area and go to another area and they're doing exceptionally well, that was potentially an officer that come out of our community that could have been hired in our community. So you got to look at, it's something you got to constantly look at. And that's where the SWOT analysis, all kinds of HR assessment tools that you can put in place to help you remain relevant in the business climate that you're in. You can't get away from this kind of thing in organizations as critical as public safety.
Let me ask
Because
this.
they
Let me ask
grow.
this because we got only we only have 2 minutes left. Good gracious, for an
Wow.
hour. Wow, just
Wow.
2 minutes left.
That went fast.
Did that
That
go
went fast.
fast, Chief? Let me
Yes,
ask
sir.
you. There are people saying that you need to live in the community. You need to have some relationship with the community to be effective. What's your position on that? And I know this is something that that mayors and police chiefs grapple with for long time, because a lot of times people have already established their residency in other places that may be in proximity, and to have them uprooted from where they live, their children have go to school and that kind of thing. A lot of times that's viewed to be unfair, and it places you in a competitive disadvantage if you impose that in terms of getting quality officers. So it's a double-edged sword. What's your position
Right.
on people living in communities they police?
I believe if you can get officers to live in the jurisdiction that they police, I believe that, we often hear people say, I want you to drive through here like your children live here, or I want you to police this neighborhood like you live here. I want you to police this neighborhood like your mom lived here, your grandmother lived here. It gives you ownership to the terms and conditions of the neighborhoods. And, but what it does, it gives you a personal relationship with people, period. Because now you come in and go out of the same neighborhood or the same community. So you have a vested interest in being able to go and come safely, or your loved ones be able to go and come safely. It's challenging because a lot of times you get into the things about affordable housing. And I know that there have been some recruitment strategies where they've worked with their Chamber of Commerce, they've worked with their housing and realty companies to create incentives for first responders to live in the communities. And I believe there's been an increase of first responders in the city. But you have to be intentional, and you have to use that as part of your recruitment strategy to bring those people. And now I think another part that's very important, you have to intentionally
Chief,
try to recruit
you know you're gonna
from your
get
community.
you're gonna get me kicked off the radio. We've reached
Uh-oh.
5 o'clock already, 1 o'clock already. I'm so
Uh-oh.
appreciative of you, Chief, and Chief. And I call him
Thank you
Chief
for having me.
because he's always the chief to me. And of course, if he gets to be the sheriff, he'll be Chief Sheriff, David Alexander. But I'm appreciative for you always to come on and to share your thoughts. It's always good to hear your perspective on this. We have an issue with policing that must be addressed. This is not something that's going to be done overnight or by
Right.
chance. We have to be intentional about this, and there has to be people at the table who will speak truth to power. We cannot just have people who are now Johnny come lately trying to come up with some imaginary way of reimagining policing without understanding the history of policing and understanding the intricacies of policing, and that's critically important. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. We should have it. Let's continue
Yes,
to have it.
yeah, I would love that. I would love that.
All right. Well, the clock on the wall says it's time for us to get up out of here. We're going to be doing the Juneteenth thing next week. We'll have Attorney Nola Aird as well as Theopia Jackson, the PhD, Dr. Theopia Jackson, who is the president of the Association of Black Psychologists. We have them on next week talking about liberating the Black mind and self liberation, because liberation cannot take place from external. It must be internal. Power succeeds nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. Well, the clock on the wall says it's time for us to get up out of here. I really do appreciate it, and I would thank you. In fact, I'm asking for your support of this program by sending your checks and money orders in care of You Got the Power. That's P.O. Box 146, Tuskegee, Alabama, 36087. Also, you can support us on our Facebook page by clicking on our PayPal or Cash App and support this program. We will be greatly appreciative if you do. As always, we like to leave you with these two words. Remember that I love you with a perfect love. But more importantly, remember this: you got the power. We'll see you next week, same time, same station. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.